The rejection hit my phone at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, which would have been annoying if it had been ordinary and devastating if it had been honest. Instead, it was precise in the most insulting way possible. Application denied. Screening data unchanged. Lease offer withdrawn at midnight. That line mattered because 10 minutes earlier I had been staring at the same file from the other side of the wall. Inside our dispute system, the report on my rental application had already been corrected. The duplicate eviction entry was gone. The status on the case read corrected in clean green text. But on the landlord delivery panel beside it, the message still showed no change. If you need the frame before the trap closes, this happened inside Mirrorloop Housing Signals, a fictional tenant screening division owned by a very fictional platform empire called Mirrorloop Social. The company was invented. The people were invented. The way records moved through that system, though, was realistic enough to ruin a perfectly good apartment by midnight. I am Iris Vale. I was 29 then, and I worked as a senior dispute specialist, which meant I spent most days fixing the kind of paperwork mess that looked small to executives and life-changing to everyone else. My job was to take angry, scared, or confused people and translate their problem into the one language our system respected: documented inconsistency. I had been good enough at it that my manager used to say I could smell a bad merge through drywall. He meant it as a joke. In our department, jokes were how people admitted the machine was mean without saying the machine was wrong. At 8:30 the next morning, I walked into the 12th floor glass conference room with my laptop, my memo draft, and the hard little feeling in my stomach that shows up when you know the records and the official story are about to disagree. Dorian Keene was already there in his usual gray t-shirt, hands loose at his sides, standing in front of a floor-to-ceiling wall that rotated through growth dashboards, client churn maps, and a VR occupancy model the product team loved because it made bad decisions look futuristic. He never raised his voice in meetings. That was part of why people mistook him for reasonable. He let the wall behind him do the intimidation for him. Numbers moved. Regions glowed. A line chart tilted up in the exact blue the design team reserved for trust-related messaging, which had always felt like a cruel joke to me. He was saying, "We are 5 days from the quarter renewal window, so we need quiet accuracy, not dramatic accuracy," when I sat down. He clicked to a slide labeled Client Stability, and the room stopped sounding like a meeting and started sounding like a guided surrender. Then he used the phrase he liked when he wanted everyone to feel embarrassed for still being human. Emotion is noise unless it changes retention. No one wrote that down, but everyone heard it. At Mirrorloop, phrases like that moved faster than policy updates. They became culture before anyone admitted they were instructions. The problem was that there was already a written instruction too. It lived under a harmless name in the team protocol library, Client Com Window. If a report had already been delivered to a landlord or property manager, and if a dispute later led to a correction, the corrected version did not automatically go back out. It waited for what leadership called a batch review. The stated purpose was to avoid confusing downstream partners with excessive notice volatility. What that meant in plain English was simpler. If we found an error after a landlord had already seen the first version, leadership preferred the landlord remain comfortably wrong until the company decided the timing felt convenient. That policy sat in quiet tension with another document, one I had read enough times to know the paragraph breaks by heart. Maximum accuracy and 24-hour correction SLA. Dorian had signed it 3 months earlier after a client threatened to move to a competitor over dispute latency. Under that agreement, once a screening dispute was resolved in favor of the applicant, an updated result had to be transmitted within 24 hours unless a legal hold existed. There was no legal hold on my file. There was no ambiguity either. So the file on my screen that Tuesday night had shown me something impossible. The dispute outcome was in. The duplicate entry was removed internally. But the external delivery panel still showed no change, and by the time that contradiction finished glowing at me, the apartment I wanted was gone. I didn't speak in the meeting until Dorian opened the floor 4 operational risk items, and even then I kept my voice flat. "I found a correction path conflict in high-priority housing disputes," I said. At least one corrected report remained externally unchanged after internal resolution. A few people glanced up. Mara Chen from Client Success did not. She was already looking at me, which told me she knew exactly what category of disaster I was about to name. Dorian nodded like I had mentioned a slow printer. "Is this a processing lag or a message timing issue?" "Neither," I said. "The dispute resolution completed." The client notification did not update. I had the case record and delivery state. That got a few more heads up. Not because it was dramatic, but because everyone in that room knew the difference between a lag and a state conflict. A lag was bad luck. A state conflict meant somebody had taught the system to tell two different truths at once. Dorian folded his arms. Then document it. Do not re-notify clients before review. We don't create secondary panic off a single file. Single file. That was the first lie of the day, and maybe the laziest. I already knew mine wasn't the only one because our dispute queue grouped similar source collisions together, and duplicate eviction records had spiked in the previous 10 days. But the company had trained people to treat patterns as anecdotes until legal or revenue made them expensive. I said, I'll submit an accuracy escalation memo within the hour. Good, he said. Route it normally. I almost smiled at that, because normal routing was exactly what I wanted. If he had told me to keep it verbal, I would have known I was already too late. On the way back to my desk, I passed the dispute pod where the newer analysts sat with their noise-canceling headsets and their soft panic. One of them, a woman named Mia who had joined 6 weeks earlier, looked up at me with that expression people wear when they know something is wrong but have not yet decided whether being the first person to say it out loud is career suicide. Is this about the Mercer cluster? She asked quietly. I stopped. Why? She lowered her voice even more. I saw 2 reversals yesterday that never changed on the client side. I thought I had misread the queue. That was not proof, but it was texture, and texture matters when you are trying to decide whether a machine is glitching or lying. I told her not to touch anything yet. Then I wrote the 2 case IDs on the back of my notebook and kept walking. Back at my desk, I opened the file chain on my own application first, even though I knew better than to get personal when I was working. The duplicate eviction match came from a third-party court data feed that had collapsed 2 county records into one profile. Our dispute engine had accepted my supporting documents at 4:12 p.m. The corrected status posted at 4:39. The delivery pane still showed the original output at 4:41, 6:05, and 10:53 p.m. Each time stamped no change. That part mattered, because a true lag would have left ambiguity. Repeated no change states did not happen by accident. They happened because a rule was being applied on purpose. I wrote the memo the way I always wrote them when I wanted them to survive contact with management. No adjectives. No moral theater. Just timeline, file IDs, rule conflict, business exposure, and one sentence at the end that made the whole thing harder to bury. Applicant harm already occurred. Contract exposure remains active until corrected results are transmitted or a lawful exception is documented. Then I attached 3 screenshots, the corrected dispute record, the unchanged delivery panel, and the denial notice on my own rental application with my address blacked out except for the property code. I submitted it through the normal escalation channel and copied my direct manager, compliance operations, and client success. Mara messaged me 3 minutes later. Did you just attach a corrected result sample to the Harlow account? I wrote back, yes. The sample is lawful. The file is resolved. The issue is that the client still has the wrong status. Her typing bubble appeared and disappeared twice before she sent the answer I expected from somebody who understood the danger and hated it. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying he's going to say you skipped sequence. I asked for it in writing. That bought me half an hour of peace. It was enough time to review 5 similar disputes from the same feed cluster. 3 had the same pattern. Corrected internally. No client update. 1 still sat in queue. 1 had been marked closed with no second transmission at all. By noon, I had a spreadsheet that was ugly in the way only real evidence gets ugly. Not theatrical ugly. Not cinematic ugly. Just rows, timestamps, source IDs, decision states, and a column showing whether a landlord had received the corrected result. Most had not. At 12:14, Mara sent me a screenshot from the client portal. A corrected sample had arrived in the Harlow account mailbox because the escalation path I used generated a legal trace copy before leadership approval. That meant one thing. My memo had just become external evidence. At 12:21, Dorian asked me to join him in a smaller conference room with frosted walls and no windows. That was one of his habits. He saved public calm for meetings and private pressure for rooms that swallowed sound. He did not sit down. Why did client success receive a corrected sample? Because the dispute result was complete and the system permits escalation trace routing. It permits internal review. It routed a trace copy, I said. That's part of the review chain. His expression barely changed. Do you know why the COM window exists? To delay notice volatility, I said. To protect account trust, he replied. Clients don't need our team panicking every time a record changes. The record didn't just change, I said. It was wrong. He looked at me for a beat too long. You're close to this because it touched your own application. I knew better than to argue the premise. People like Dorian loved changing the question from whether a record was false to whether the person noticing it was too emotional to be credible. So I stayed with procedure. Then pull me off my own case and assign another reviewer. But the state conflict still exists. He gave me a thin smile that never reached his eyes. Document it. Stop routing samples. Let operations review the pattern quietly. Quietly. Another word that meant wrong things were about to become official. I spent the rest of the afternoon doing exactly what policy said I should do and what Dorian probably assumed would slow me down enough to keep the damage small. I logged each affected case. I filed a pattern risk note. I requested formal clarification on how ComWindow interacted with the signed correction SLA. I asked whether leadership had approved any temporary exception. I used neutral language so dry it would have made a lawyer yawn. By 5 o'clock, I had not received a response to any of those questions. What I did receive was a calendar hold titled Process Integrity Review at 8 a.m. the next morning, with HR copied. That was when I knew he had stopped treating me as a dispute specialist and started treating me as a containment problem. My direct manager, Paul Renner, called me just before 6. Paul had survived long enough at Mirror Loop to speak in cautious half-steps, which was its own form of intelligence. He was not brave, but he was not stupid either. You pushed this high, he said without greeting me. It was already high. That's not the same thing. I looked at the empty office around me. Do you think the file on my screen changed itself? He exhaled. I think renewal week is the wrong time to force a principal fight. That told me everything I needed to know about where management ended and gravity began in that building. To him, this was still a debate about timing. To me, the wrong report had already cost somebody a lease. Timing had come and gone. Before he hung up, he said, "Be careful tomorrow. They'll make this about process discipline." It is about process discipline, I said. Just not mine. The next morning, I badged into the office and got the first hard answer from the building itself. My credentials still opened the lobby gate and the elevator. They did not open the dispute floor. The red strip across the access panel said privileges updated. I tried my laptop anyway when I found an empty desk on another level. My queue would not load. My case history pane returned a permission error. The dispute archive tool, the one I had spent years teaching new hires to use without breaking audit hygiene, did not even recognize my role anymore. 30 seconds later, HR called. The woman introducing herself as Lynn from Employee Integrity had a voice so carefully neutral it sounded pre-approved. We need to discuss concerns regarding unauthorized handling of sensitive screening outputs. Unauthorized. There it was. Not inaccurate records. Not breach of SLA. Not misleading client state. Unauthorized handling. She scheduled me for 8:45 in a room on 17. By then I had already checked my employee dashboard and seen that my relocation stipend for the new apartment had been suspended pending review. My internal transfer application, the one I had been waiting on for weeks, now showed deferred. The lease I had tried to secure the night before was officially gone. That was the midpoint, though I didn't know to call it that then. I only knew I had lost my system access, my housing, my stipend, and the clean internal path I thought would fix the problem. Dorian had recognized what I was actually doing and cut the line exactly where it fed me evidence. The most humiliating part was not the loss itself. It was how clinically it had been packaged. My stipend page did not say cancelled. It said pending review. My transfer file did not say blocked. It said deferred for alignment. My access panel did not say you noticed the wrong thing. It said privileges updated. Mirror Loop was very good at turning punishment into administrative weather. HR's interview was almost boring, which made it worse. Lynn did not accuse me of fraud, because fraud would have required facts. She accused me of bypassing approved communication sequencing. She used phrases like boundary discipline and stakeholder sensitivity. She asked why I had included a corrected sample on a trace route without executive clearance. I answered every question the same way: the dispute result had been finalized, the trace route was system permitted, and the signed correction SLA required timely transmission unless a lawful hold existed. She took notes. She asked whether my own rental application had compromised my judgment. No, I said. It confirmed the business harm. That was the first time she looked up sharply. I had stepped out of the role of apologetic employee and back into the role I actually understood, someone describing exposure. At the end of the meeting, she said the company would preserve relevant records while the review proceeded. She probably thought that sentence meant reassurance. To me, it sounded like a door. Because I knew what preserved relevant records meant in practice. It meant litigation hold style handling. It meant logs stopped aging out on their normal cleanup schedule. It meant somebody in legal or compliance would have to bless the retention. It meant the company had just given me a lawful path to the deeper layer. The trick was that I no longer had internal access. So I had to stop behaving like an employee solving an operations issue and start behaving like the person the system had hurt. That afternoon, I submitted a formal consumer disclosure request for my own file through the external applicant portal. Full source disclosure. Match basis. Delivery history. Dispute resolution path. If a landlord had seen a result about me, I wanted every internal label and every external output state that touched it. Then I sent one short email to Lynn and HR and copied the legal preservation alias listed in the policy handbook. Since my personal housing application was directly affected by the dispute record at issue, please preserve all records relating to internal resolution status, external delivery state, policy exceptions, and any manual changes to correction routing behavior connected to my file and similarly situated disputes. I did not threaten anyone. I did not mention a lawsuit. I did not write anything emotional. I asked them to preserve the exact categories a competent review would need. That bought me another message, this time from external counsel at Calder and Voss. Her name was Elise Moreno, and her tone was better than HR's because it was honest about being defensive. She said the company had received my preservation request and would process my disclosure packet under the usual timetable. She also said the employee review and the consumer request were separate matters. That sentence told me two useful things. First, legal already understood the employee review would not be enough to contain the issue. Second, they were now tracking the matter in two systems, which increased the odds that inconsistent explanations would leave a footprint. 3 days later, the disclosure packet arrived. Anyone who has never dealt with one of those packets thinks the drama is in what they reveal. Usually the drama is in what they avoid. Mine came as a bland PDF with source descriptions, date ranges, dispute outcome labels, and a tidy statement that the challenged information had been updated. What it did not include was the one thing I needed to connect the record to the external harm, the specific source mapping that created the duplicate match. That omission would not have meant much to an ordinary applicant. To me, it was louder than an admission. We had to maintain mapping provenance when a source collision caused an adverse action. If the packet omitted the mapping layer, someone had chosen the version of disclosure that looked complete to outsiders and stayed comfortable for leadership. I printed the packet and laid it beside the screenshots I still had from before my access disappeared. Internal correction. External no change. Incomplete source disclosure. 3 different systems, all bending in the same direction. Mara called me that night from her personal phone, which I knew she hated doing. She didn't want to be a witness. She wanted to survive the quarter. I can't send you anything, she said before I spoke. I'm not asking you to. There was a long pause. Harlow's legal team asked why they received one corrected sample and no batch update. They said if a corrected file exists, they need to know whether other adverse actions were left unresolved. I closed my eyes for a second. What did leadership say? That the sample was generated in error during internal handling. That was the second big lie, and this one had to live outside the building to survive. which meant if it broke, it would break harder. Did they ask for logs? I said. They asked whether updated reports had been transmitted within the SLA window. And? Another pause. There's a reason risk brought in Northline. I sat up straighter. Northline is in? For a focused process check, she said quickly, like the phrase itself might protect her. That's all I know. That was enough. Northline Audit Partners was one of the few names in our universe that made executives sit like students. They did not shout. They did not moralize. They asked for exports, timestamps, approval chains, and system definitions. If they were in, the argument was no longer about whether I was difficult. It was about whether the company could survive the record trail it had created. The next morning, Elise from Calder and Voss asked whether I would attend a limited review interview as the affected applicant and reporting employee. That was legal's way of consolidating risk without admitting consolidation. I agreed on one condition. I wanted confirmation that the relevant routing and delivery records had been preserved. She gave it to me in writing. He thought that was the end of it. I think that now because his next move was too polished to come from panic. He sent a company-wide note to the dispute division reminding staff that unauthorized messaging around corrected outputs could cause client confusion and regulatory noise. He never used my name. He did not need to. Anyone in my group could hear the message under the message. Do not help the wrong facts travel. I brought the disclosure packet, my screenshots, and my timeline to the review interview. Elise attended. Lynn attended. So did a Northline auditor named Benjamin Ho, who had the unsettling habit of being polite right before he dismantled something important. He began by asking me to describe, in order, what I saw on the night my application was denied. I did. I kept it procedural. Internal corrected state. External no change. Adverse action already triggered. No visible legal hold. Then I described the escalation memo, the trace route, the meeting with Dorian, and the access revocation the next morning. Benjamin was the first person in the entire process who asked follow-up questions like he wanted the mechanism instead of the narrative. He asked whether our queue distinguished between corrected content and corrected delivery. He asked whether dispute agents could manually verify external refreshes. He asked what language appeared when a landlord received a revised file. Those questions sound small until you realize they are how an auditor separates a bad outcome from a deliberate design choice. I told him that our agents could confirm state, not force delivery. That control sat above us. I told him that a revised file should generate an updated decision packet and a new outbound event, not just a greener internal label. I told him that if leadership wanted to claim this was all a misunderstanding, they would eventually have to explain why no new outbound event appeared after the corrected result was already final. Benjamin asked the question nobody inside operations had wanted to ask out loud. In your professional judgment, could the no-change state result from ordinary queue latency? Not with repeated confirmations at those times, I said. Not after final resolution. Not without a rule or a toggle. He wrote that down and asked for my basis. Delivery state and dispute state are separate services, I said. If the dispute closes and the delivery does not update, either an exception is documented or the resend path is disabled. The system does not just forget the client exists. That got Elise's attention in a way HR never could have. Legal people love verbs like documented and disabled because they imply checkable facts. The next 2 days were quiet in the way offices get quiet when they are waiting for logs to come back. No one contacted me directly. My badge still worked only for public floors. My transfer remained frozen. My stipend stayed suspended. The silence was supposed to feel like isolation. Instead, it felt like a countdown. I used the time to rebuild the chain from memory. I wrote out every point where our system touched an applicant's life. Source intake. Match confidence. Adverse output. Dispute submission. Analyst review. Resolution state. Delivery state. Client acknowledgement. It sounds obsessive when I say it now, but repetition is sometimes the only way to keep a company from gaslighting you with its own complexity. At home, I spread printouts across my kitchen table and marked them with colored tabs like I was studying for an exam in how not to be erased. green for internal corrections, red for external harm, blue for anything signed by leadership. By the second night, even without new logs, the pattern had become obvious enough that I stopped wondering whether I had overreacted. The only remaining question was how far up the deliberate part went. On Friday afternoon, Elise emailed to say Northline had requested follow-up on client notification behavior and internal approval settings. She did not share the records. She didn't have to. The wording told me they had found enough to move from applicant harm to system design. That night, I went back through my old training decks from memory and made myself a list of which controls could suppress corrected output sends without altering dispute resolution itself. There were only two practical options. A client account could be placed under a documented notice hold, or an administrator could disable the auto-resend function at the routing layer. Harlow was not under hold. If it had been, the policy dashboard would have forced a Resend code into the escalation sample metadata. I had seen no such code. So the math narrowed. Monday morning brought the document I had been waiting for without knowing exactly what shape it would take. Elise forwarded a supplemental disclosure sheet for completeness. It was only 2 pages, and buried in the middle was a line that looked ordinary until you knew the system architecture. Correction transmission subject to account-level routing settings. That was the first time anyone outside operations admitted routing settings were relevant. Which meant Northline had already touched the layer Dorian thought nobody would reach. I replied with one sentence. Please confirm whether account-level routing settings can suppress corrected result delivery after dispute resolution is complete. She answered 3 hours later. Account-level settings may affect notification behavior, yes. Yes. That tiny word opened the whole machine. I printed that email too and added it to the pile on my table, because admissions are often strongest when they arrive disguised as clarifications. For days, leadership had acted as though the conflict was emotional, procedural, maybe even personal. That single yes dragged the whole argument back to engineering and authority, where it belonged. Settings could affect delivery. Therefore somebody had chosen a setting. Therefore somebody could own the consequence. By then I no longer needed a confession. I needed sequence. I needed to know who touched the setting, when it changed, and whether it conflicted with the signed SLA. Benjamin invited me back for a brief clarification meeting the next day. This time he did not ask broad questions. He asked narrow ones, which meant he already had the records and needed context, not theory. When your team discussed correction volume during renewal week, he said, who had authority to change resend behavior? Vice President level or delegated trust systems admin under written approval? Would that require a log? Yes. It should leave an approval record and a permission event. He nodded. And if the correction SLA remained active? Then disabling resend would create a contract conflict unless the SLA was formally suspended. He made one more note and slid a printed page across the table. Half of the content was redacted. The part that remained was enough. Service, delivery resend controller. Setting, auto resend. Previous state, on. New state, off. Timestamp, Wednesday 5:02 p.m. M approving role, VP Trust Systems. Wednesday at 5:02 p.m. M. My dispute had closed at 4:39 p.m. M. Harlow had received the trace sample afternoon the next day. My access had been revoked Friday morning. The toggle had been changed right in the middle, exactly where the story shifted from error to choice. There was another line farther down the page that made the whole thing even cleaner. Reason field, temporary client stability control. Not legal hold. Not regulator request. Not source unreliability review. Client stability control. In other words, Dorian had translated embarrassment risk into a system setting and hoped contract language would never catch up to him. Then the math stopped working for him. I did not touch the paper for a second. I just looked at the timestamp and thought about how many people in companies like ours believe the truth is whatever they can keep moving inside the right interface. Benjamin tapped the lower corner of the page. We also located the SLA approval packet. Of course they had. The packet showed Dorian's signature under the 24-hour correction obligation and a side note from negotiations where he had insisted the SLA would be a selling point because Mirrorloop's routing controls were more precise than legacy screening vendors. That sentence would have been funny if it hadn't cost me a home. At that point, the evidence chain no longer depended on my credibility. That is the best place a woman can reach in a system built to weigh her tone before her facts. We had the corrected dispute state, the external no change state, the incomplete disclosure mapping, the resend toggle log, and the signed SLA. Different systems. Different owners. Same direction. Northline issued its finding to Risk 2 days later. They did not send it to me directly, but at least summarized enough for the result to land with proper force. Mirror Loop had allowed corrected screening outcomes to remain externally unchanged under routing settings that conflicted with contractual correction commitments. Review of approval records identified executive-level involvement in the setting change. Client notice and remediation were recommended immediately. Recommended was the elegant word. Enforced was the real one. Harlow suspended their interface that afternoon. Mara sent me a single line from a conference room I was no longer allowed to enter. They paused everything for 30 days. That was the business consequence I had wanted all along, not because I enjoy damage, but because platforms only understand pain when it reaches revenue or renewal. No motivational talk would have corrected that system. A paused client feed did. The suspension triggered other things fast. A pending executive review on the division's renewal forecast disappeared from calendars. Finance froze a revenue recognition note tied to the Harlow account. Product had to answer why a routing control described as a trust feature could silently suppress corrections. Suddenly, dozens of people who had never cared about dispute architecture became very interested in the exact meaning of external no change. The company moved fast once the harm was billable. Legal sent updated result notices to affected accounts. Risk required a full resend review on recent corrected disputes. Operations had to produce a list of every case where corrected did not mean delivered. Client success spent 48 hours calling people they had tried very hard not to disturb earlier in the week. Dorian did not disappear. Men like him almost never do on the first day. They are too structurally useful. But he lost the thing that had made him dangerous in this story. His signature authority over correction routing was revoked. He was removed from the renewal meetings. His equity refresh for the quarter was suspended pending committee review. I learned that not from gossip, but from an internal outcome letter Elise was finally allowed to share because it also resolved my employee review. The company withdrew the integrity inquiry, restored my personnel standing, and confirmed that my access suspension had been a temporary control measure, which was their sterile way of admitting they had treated the witness like the breach. My relocation stipend did not come back in time to save the original apartment, and I would be lying if I said that didn't still sting. Rules can correct a system without restoring every version of the life it interrupted. But Harlow reran my application under the corrected file, and this time the result cleared in less than 6 minutes. Mara called me again after the rerun. For what it's worth, she said, you were right about the pattern. I know. She laughed once, tired and almost fond. You could let me give you that. You can buy me a coffee when this quarter ends. If we still have a quarter. We did, of course. Companies like MirrorLoop do not die because one honest workflow finally reaches daylight. They absorb, rename, restructure, and keep moving. That was why the new office mattered more to me than Dorian's embarrassment. 3 weeks later, I started in the newly created Accuracy office on the 12th floor, which used to be part of Trust Systems before Trust Systems became too expensive to trust. The team was small at first. Me, 2 analysts from compliance, 1 engineer who actually liked audit language, and a rotating liaison from client success. Our mandate was narrow and, for once, useful. Any corrected screening outcome had to auto-resend by default, and any attempt to suppress that send required dual approval with an audit alias copied in. The engineer who built the new control joked that he was giving the system a conscience. I told him not to flatter software. We were just making it harder for management to lie in 2 places at once. I moved into a smaller apartment a week after that. It wasn't the unit I had originally wanted, but it had clean windows, a quiet hall, and a lease approved by a report that finally described me as I actually was instead of as a duplicate of somebody else's mistake. The first night there, I ate takeout on the floor because my furniture hadn't arrived yet and listened to the building settle around me like a decision I did not have to argue with. What stayed with me most was not the committee letter or the restored file or even the paused interface. It was the memory of that phrase in the glass conference room. Emotion is noise unless it changes retention. He believed that. He believed people were just variables that mattered when they moved a graph. The weakness in that logic was never moral. People like Dorian can survive moral criticism all day. The weakness was mechanical. If you teach a system to stay corrected while the outside world still sees no change, eventually the graph learns to hate you too. By the time the quarter officially closed, Northline had finished the first remediation audit. More than one client account had been affected, though not on the scale leadership first feared. Enough to force process reform. Not enough to sink the division. Exactly the kind of outcome real companies prefer: painful, survivable, impossible to spin as a win. My final transfer paperwork came through on a Thursday morning with an updated title and a line assigning me responsibility for exception review and Resend integrity. The title itself didn't matter much. The access map did. I now had authority to review any manual suppression request across the division, and no vice president could turn that function off without another department seeing the trace. That was the lasting change. Not that one powerful man had a bad month. Not that I had gotten a cleaner answer than he expected. The lasting change was that his favorite kind of decision, the quiet one hidden behind a polished dashboard, now had to leave a witness in the room. Sometimes people ask whether I felt vindicated. I never know how to answer that without disappointing them. Vindication sounds warm. This was colder than that. I did not get my original apartment back. I did not get an apology worth keeping. I did not watch anyone escorted from the building under dramatic fluorescent light. What I got was better suited to the kind of work I do. I got a corrected process, a visible log, a restored file, and a standing rule that made the next lie harder to tell. I got a company forced to admit that internal accuracy means nothing if the outside world never receives it. And maybe that is why I never felt tempted to make the ending louder than it was. People expect revenge stories to end with humiliation, with a speech, with somebody begging in a hallway. Real institutional damage is quieter. It sounds like a client counsel asking for 30 days of paused transmission. It looks like a signature right disappearing from a workflow. It feels like opening a dashboard on a Friday morning and realizing the machine now has to tell the truth in both directions. On my first Friday in the new office, I opened the morning digest at 7:12 a.m. 3 corrected files had auto-resent overnight. 2 client accounts had acknowledged receipt. 1 suppression request was pending dual approval with the audit alias already copied. The dashboard glowed the same sterile blue it always had. The difference was that now, when the screen said corrected, it meant somebody outside the company would finally see it.